November 23, 1942, RAF Chelveston, England. Colonel Curtis Emerson LeMay climbed into the cockpit of his B-17 Flying Fortress, knowing that in the next few hours he would either validate the most controversial tactical decision of the European air war or watch his men die, proving him catastrophically wrong. The order he had issued 3 days earlier violated every instinct bomber crews had developed through months of combat over occupied Europe. No evasive action during the bombing run. Fly straight and level through the flak barrage for as long as it took the bombardier to line up the target and release the bombs. His crews thought he was insane. His superiors hadn't explicitly approved the tactic, and German anti-aircraft batteries at Saint-Nazaire, France, were among the deadliest in Hitler's Atlantic Wall defences. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But LeMay had done the mathematics. He had studied the combat reports. He had watched mission after mission return from Germany with bomb damage assessments showing scattered impacts hundreds of yards from the aiming point. The Norden bomb site, that miraculous $15,000 piece of precision engineering that could supposedly drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 25,000 feet, was being rendered useless by pilots doing exactly what their training told them to do: stay alive through evasive maneuvers. The problem was simple in theory, devastating in practice. German flak batteries fired 88mm shells programmed to explode at specific altitudes, creating clouds of razor-sharp shrapnel that could shred aluminum skin, sever control cables, and kill crew members in an instant. Radar directed the guns with increasing accuracy as German technology improved through 1942. The natural human response, the response drilled into every pilot during training, was to jink, to weave, to never fly straight for more than a few seconds when enemy guns had you ranged. But every course correction, every altitude change, every slight deviation from straight and level flight during those final seconds before bomb release destroyed the bombardier's carefully calculated firing solution. The Norden bomb site computed the trajectory based on airspeed, altitude, wind velocity, and the target's position relative to the aircraft. It needed 10 to 15 seconds of absolutely stable flight to calculate and execute the release. When pilots took evasive action, the gyroscopes tumbled, the calculations became worthless, and the bombs fell wherever momentum and gravity took them, usually nowhere near the target. The waste was staggering. 8th Air Force bombers were flying deep into enemy territory, fighting through German fighter screens, losing aircraft and crews at unsustainable rates, and then missing their targets because pilots tried to keep their men alive during the final bomb run. Missions had to be repeated. Industrial targets that should have been destroyed in one raid required 3 or 4 attacks. Each additional mission meant more losses, more replacement crews needed, more aircraft diverted from production runs in Seattle and Long Beach to replace bombers shot down over Europe. LeMay had come to England in October 1942, commanding the 305th Bomb Group, one of the first B-17 units assigned to 8th Air Force. At 36 years old, he was among the youngest group commanders in the Army Air Forces, promoted to full colonel earlier that year after proving himself as one of the service's most skilled navigators and tactical thinkers. But age and rank meant nothing if he couldn't get bombs on target. General Ira Eaker, commanding 8th Air Force, was under intense pressure from General Henry Arnold back in Washington to prove that American daylight precision bombing could work. The British had abandoned daylight operations after taking catastrophic losses in 1940 and 1941. They told the Americans it was suicide. Fly at night, scatter your bombs across German cities, and hope you hit something important. The Americans insisted they could do better. Daylight attacks with precision bomb sites, striking specific industrial targets, ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, oil refineries, the specific installations that kept the German war machine functioning. Destroy those, and you destroy Germany's ability to wage war without having to carpet bomb cities and kill hundreds of thousands of civilians. But precision required hitting the target, and hitting the target required flying straight and level through the worst anti-aircraft fire the Germans could throw at you. LeMay had spent weeks analysing combat reports from the 305th and the other early groups flying from England. The pattern was unmistakable. Accuracy was abysmal. On missions where groups employed heavy evasive action over the target, bombs scattered across countryside and residential areas, missing industrial facilities entirely. Post-mission reconnaissance photos showed craters in farm fields, damaged civilian houses, destroyed barns. The military targets remained operational, requiring return visits that German fighters eagerly anticipated. He ran the numbers on aircraft losses. The conventional wisdom held that evasive maneuvers reduced casualties by making it harder for flak to hit you. But LeMay's analysis suggested otherwise. Most bombers lost over Europe went down from fighter attacks, not flak. German fighters concentrated on crippled aircraft that fell out of formation, or stragglers that couldn't keep up after taking damage. They hunted damaged bombers like wolves culling wounded animals from a herd. The combat box formation provided mutual defensive fire that made attacking healthy formations costly for German fighters. But formations fell apart when individual aircraft took evasive action at different times in different directions while trying to maintain position relative to their squadron. More importantly, LeMay calculated the actual hit probability for German flak against bombers flying at operational altitudes. 88mm guns fired shells that took approximately 30 seconds to reach 25,000 feet. During that time, the shell traveled 5 miles vertically while the bomber flew forward at roughly 3 miles per minute. The Germans had to predict where the bomber would be when the shell arrived, accounting for altitude, speed, wind, and the bomber's potential evasive maneuvers. Running the mathematics, accounting for the dispersion pattern of shell fragments, the armor protection on B-17 seconds, and the time exposure over target, LeMay calculated that an individual bomber flying straight and level through a typical flak barrage had approximately 1 chance in 372 of being shot down by anti-aircraft fire. The numbers were actually on the side of the bomber, not the gunner. The terrifying visual spectacle of flak bursts, the black puffs of smoke appearing in clusters around the formation, the thunderous concussions rattling aircraft structures, created a psychological effect far beyond the actual physical danger. Men died from flak, certainly, but statistically, not as many as died from fighters, from mechanical failures, from collisions in bad weather, or from the accumulating stress of repeated missions. LeMay presented his analysis to his squadron commanders at a meeting that became legendary in 305th Group history. He told them that evasive action was costing them the war, that missing targets meant flying more missions, that flying more missions meant more total exposure to both flak and fighters, that the shortest path to going home alive was hitting the target on the first try, and that meant flying straight and level through the flak, no matter how terrifying it looked. The reaction was predictable. His pilots thought he had lost his mind. His bombardiers were skeptical. His gunners, who had no control over the aircraft but had to ride along while officers made decisions, were openly terrified. The consensus among combat crews was that Iron Ass LeMay, who had earned that unflattering nickname through his demanding training regimen and intolerance for excuses, was going to get them all killed trying to prove some mathematical theory that ignored the reality of combat. LeMay understood their objections. He had flown combat missions himself. He knew what it felt like to sit in a bomber while flak burst around the formation, each explosion a potential death sentence, each black puff a reminder that German gunners were trying to kill you. The instinct to move, to change course, to do something other than fly straight toward the guns was hardwired into human survival programming. Every evolutionary instinct screamed at you to evade, to zigzag, to make yourself a harder target. But LeMay also understood that wars weren't won by instinct. They were won by discipline, by training, by forcing yourself to do the tactically correct action even when every fiber of your being wanted to do something else. A fighter pilot could trust his instincts because fighter combat was fluid, dynamic, constantly changing. But bomber operations required systematic application of doctrine, careful calculation, and the courage to stay on course when everything in your nervous system told you to break away. He made them a promise. He would fly the first mission using the new tactic. He would be in the lead bomber, the aircraft that German fighters and flak batteries would target first. He would demonstrate that the mathematics worked, that you could fly straight through the flak and survive, that hitting the target justified the risk. If he was wrong, if his calculations were flawed, if the tactic proved suicidal, he would be the first to die, proving it. That promise mattered. LeMay had a reputation for leading from the front. He never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. When the 305th flew difficult missions, LeMay was in the lead aircraft. When they tested new tactics, LeMay went first. His willingness to stake his own life on his tactical theories gave those theories credibility they wouldn't otherwise have possessed. If Iron Ass was willing to fly straight through the flak without evasive action, maybe the idea wasn't completely insane. The mission planners selected Saint-Nazaire as the target for the test. The French Atlantic port housed German submarine pens, massive concrete structures that sheltered U-boats between patrols in the Atlantic shipping lanes. Allied intelligence rated the Saint-Nazaire defences as formidable. Flak batteries ringed the port, German fighter squadrons operated from nearby airfields, and previous raids had encountered heavy resistance. It was not an easy target, not a milk run for a first test of radical new tactics, but that was precisely why LeMay chose it. If the straight-line approach worked against Saint-Nazaire's defences, it would work anywhere. 8th Air Force assembled 58 B-17 seconds for the mission, drawn from multiple groups including LeMay's 305th. The mission briefing emphasized the importance of tight formation, flying and maintaining position throughout the bomb run. Bombardiers received special instructions about the extended time on target. Pilots were told explicitly, no evasive action from the initial point to bomb release. The order was clear, unambiguous, and terrifying. The weather on November 23rd was typical for English late autumn. Low clouds covered the airfields at dawn. Crews attended briefing at 0400 hours, ate a breakfast that many couldn't finish due to nervousness, and gathered their equipment for the mission. 50 caliber ammunition for the defensive guns, flak vests weighing 30 pounds each, oxygen masks and regulators for high-altitude flight, parachutes that might save your life if you had time to bail out, but were useless if your bomber disintegrated around you. LeMay climbed aboard his aircraft, took his position in the cockpit, and began the pre-flight checklist. 4 Wright Cyclone engines, 1,200 horsepower each, coughed to life one by one, their deep rumble building to a thunderous roar that echoed across the airfield. 58 heavy bombers, each weighing 15 tons empty and 30 tons loaded with fuel and bombs, preparing to fly 300 miles to France, fight through German defences, and attempt to destroy one of Hitler's most important submarine bases using a tactic that had never been tried in combat. The takeoff was routine. The assembly over England was routine. The formation crossed the English Channel and entered French airspace without incident. German radar picked them up immediately. Luftwaffe fighter units scrambled from their bases. Anti-aircraft batteries at Saint-Nazaire received targeting information and prepared to engage. The German defenders knew the bombers were coming. They had time to prepare. They were ready. LeMay's formation approached Saint-Nazaire from the east, flying at 25,000 feet, where the thin air and intense cold made every breath a struggle despite oxygen masks. The temperature outside was 60 degrees below zero. Inside the unpressurized bombers, crews wore electrically heated suits that sometimes shorted out, leaving men to freeze slowly while completing their missions. Wind howled through the open waist gun positions where gunners stood watch, exposed to the elements, searching for German fighters that could appear without warning from any direction. The initial point, the geographic landmark where the bomb run began, appeared ahead right on schedule. LeMay's bombardier, hunched over his Norden bomb sight in the nose compartment, began his final calculations. Airspeed, altitude, wind correction, target coordinates. The sophisticated mechanical computer processed the information, made its calculations, and prepared to take control of the aircraft from the pilot for the final seconds before bomb release. And then the flak started. German batteries opened fire with methodical precision. 88mm shells climbed toward the formation, their fuses set to burst at 25,000 feet. The first explosions appeared several hundred yards in front of the lead aircraft, black puffs of smoke marking where high-explosive shells detonated, sending fragments in all directions. The gunners were bracketing the formation, finding the range, adjusting their aim for the next salvo. Every pilot in the formation felt the instinctive urge to break away, to change altitude, to do something other than fly directly into the expanding cloud of steel fragments. But LeMay held his course, straight and level. No evasion. The bombardier had control through the Norden linkage. The gyroscopes were stabilized, the calculations were running. Just a few more seconds. More shells burst around the formation, closer now. The German gunners had the altitude right. They were adjusting laterally, walking their fire across the sky toward the bomber stream. Fragments rattled against aluminum skin. Men heard the impacts, felt the aircraft shudder from nearby detonations, wondered if the next burst would tear through their fuselage and end everything in an instant. LeMay's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady despite the chaos outside. "Stay on course, hold formation, bombardiers, call when ready." The training took over. The discipline held. 58 bombers continued straight toward the target while German guns threw up a curtain of steel between them and the submarine pens below. The bombardier called ready. His calculations were complete. The release point was coming up. 5 seconds. 4. 3. The Norden bomb sight triggered the electrical release mechanism. Bomb bay doors swung open. 4,000 pounds of high-explosive ordnance fell free from each aircraft, beginning their 30-second drop toward the target 5 miles below. Bombs away. LeMay's bomber lurched upward suddenly, freed from the weight of its explosive cargo. All around the formation, other B-17 seconds experienced the same phenomenon, rising slightly as tons of bombs dropped away. The bombardiers had released at the precise, calculated instant. The bombs fell in a concentrated pattern, their trajectories determined by the careful work of men who had maintained steady flight through the most intense flak barrage they had ever encountered. Below, in the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, German personnel heard the whistling of falling bombs and dove for cover. The first explosions walked across the dock facilities with devastating precision, direct hits on support structures, near misses that created pressure waves strong enough to damage equipment. The concentration of impacts was unlike anything the Germans had seen from previous American raids. LeMay's bomber turned away from the target, maintaining formation discipline even during the escape. German flak continued to burst around the formation, but the intensity decreased as the bombers opened distance from Saint-Nazaire. Fighter attacks that intelligence had predicted never materialized in significant numbers. The Luftwaffe units scrambled to intercept had apparently been delayed or diverted to other threats. The 305th Bomb Group and the other participating units flew back across France, crossed the English Channel, and began their descent toward their English bases. The truly remarkable statistic emerged during the post-mission debrief. Not a single bomber had been lost to flak despite flying straight and level through the barrage for 7 continuous minutes. 7 minutes of exposure to concentrated anti-aircraft fire at close range. 7 minutes without evasive maneuvers. 7 minutes that conventional wisdom said should have resulted in catastrophic losses, and the formation had returned intact. But the real vindication came from the reconnaissance photographs. RAF Spitfires equipped with cameras flew over Saint-Nazaire the following morning to assess bomb damage. The photographs told a story that changed everything about American strategic bombing doctrine. The concentration of bomb impacts around the target was unprecedented. Where previous raids had scattered bombs across square miles of French countryside, LeMay's straight-line approach had put explosives directly on the submarine pens and supporting facilities. The damage assessment showed more destruction from one raid than had been achieved by multiple previous missions combined. The bombing accuracy had doubled. Not improved by 10% or 20%, doubled. 58 bombers flying straight and level had accomplished what more than 100 bombers using evasive tactics had failed to achieve in earlier attempts. The mathematical calculations had been correct. The tactical theory had worked, and most importantly, the men had come home alive to prove it. Word spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. LeMay's 305th had done something nobody thought possible. They had flown through heavy flak without evasive action, and not only survived but achieved better results than any previous mission. The other group commanders wanted to know how. The tactics officers wanted to study the mission reports. General Eaker wanted to understand if this could be replicated across the entire bomber force. LeMay provided detailed documentation. He shared his mathematical analysis of flak effectiveness. He explained the relationship between stable flight and bomb accuracy. He demonstrated how the Norden bomb sight required those critical seconds of level flight to calculate proper release. He showed how evasive maneuvers, while psychologically comforting to crews, actually increased mission risk by forcing multiple return trips to targets that should have been destroyed on the first attempt. The data was compelling. More importantly, the results were undeniable. Within weeks, other groups began testing the straight-line approach on their missions. The results confirmed what LeMay had demonstrated. Bombing accuracy improved dramatically. Target destruction increased. The need for repeat missions decreased. And contrary to every prediction from experienced combat crews, loss rates from flak did not skyrocket. The psychological breakthrough was as important as the tactical one. Bomber crews discovered that flying straight through flak, while terrifying, was actually survivable. The visual spectacle of explosions around the formation was more frightening than the actual danger. Once men understood that the mathematics favored the bomber, that the odds of a direct hit remained relatively low, even during concentrated barrages, they could force themselves to maintain discipline during the bomb run. This didn't mean flak became harmless. Men still died from shell fragments. Aircraft still took damage from near misses. But the randomness of flak casualties became apparent. A bomber flying evasive maneuvers could be hit just as easily as one flying straight, possibly more easily because the unpredictable movement made it harder for neighboring aircraft to maintain safe separation. Collisions during evasive maneuvers over targets had killed crews on several previous missions. Flying straight eliminated that particular danger entirely. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By December 1942, LeMay's tactical innovation had become standard operating procedure for the entire 8th Air Force. The official doctrine now specified straight and level flight from the initial point through bomb release, with evasive action prohibited during the actual bombing run. Formation leaders received explicit instructions to maintain course regardless of flak. Bombardiers gained effective control of the aircraft during those critical final seconds, using the Norden bomb sight to guide the bomber to the precise release point. The impact on the strategic bombing campaign was immediate and profound. Missions that had previously required 3 or 4 attempts to achieve acceptable damage now succeeded on the first try. Industrial targets received concentrated bomb loads that destroyed production capacity instead of scattered hits that the Germans could repair within weeks. Rail yards became unusable when bombs actually hit the switching facilities instead of falling into adjacent neighborhoods. Oil refineries burned when high-explosive ordnance landed on storage tanks rather than in empty fields half a mile away. German intelligence officers noticed the change. Luftwaffe reports from late 1942 and early 1943 documented increasingly accurate American bombing. Post-raid assessments showed tighter impact patterns. Damage reports from industrial managers indicated more severe destruction per raid. The Germans realized the Americans had solved their accuracy problem, though German analysts didn't immediately understand how. The secret was operational discipline, not technology. The Germans knew about the Norden bomb sight. Their intelligence services had obtained information about its capabilities through various sources. What they hadn't expected was that American crews would develop the courage to use the device properly, flying straight through flak barrages to give the bomb sight time to calculate and execute precision releases. German tactical doctrine assumed self-preservation instinct would force bombers into evasive maneuvers. LeMay had proven that training and discipline could override instinct. The 305th Bomb Group became famous throughout the 8th Air Force for pioneering the tactic. Other innovations followed from LeMay's leadership. He refined the combat box formation that positioned bombers in 3-dimensional arrays where defensive guns provided overlapping fields of fire. He developed assembly procedures that got groups into formation faster, reducing fuel consumption and crew fatigue. He instituted meticulous target studies before each mission, ensuring bombardiers understood exactly what they were attacking and why it mattered to the war effort. LeMay's reputation grew with each successful mission. His methods were harsh, his standards were uncompromising, and his personality was about as warm as the stratosphere at 25,000 feet. But he got results. His group had the highest target destruction rate in the 8th Air Force. His crews, despite flying some of the most dangerous missions over heavily defended targets, had lower casualty rates than groups using less disciplined tactics. The correlation was undeniable. Discipline saved lives. Precision reduced the need for repeat missions. Courage to fly straight through flak actually increased survival rates by accomplishing mission objectives on the first attempt. In May 1943, LeMay was promoted to brigadier general and given command of the 4th Bombardment Wing, responsible for multiple bomb groups. In September 1943, he became commanding general of the 3rd Air Division, one of the 3 major combat divisions within 8th Air Force. At 37 years old, he was one of the youngest generals in the Army Air Forces, promoted on merit and results rather than seniority or political connections. His rise through the ranks reflected how desperately the 8th Air Force needed leaders who could solve the tactical problems that were bleeding the bomber force white. In the first year of operations, 1942 through mid-1943, bomber losses were catastrophic. Groups that deployed to England with 36 aircraft were down to a dozen within months. Replacement crews arrived from training bases in America and died on their first or second missions before learning the brutal lessons of combat. The casualty rates were approaching unsustainable levels. LeMay's tactical innovations provided partial solutions. Straight-line bombing improved accuracy, which reduced repeat missions, which reduced overall exposure to German defenses. The combat box formation created mutually supporting defensive fire that made fighter attacks more costly for the Luftwaffe. Better target intelligence meant hitting the right facilities instead of wasting bombs on secondary targets. None of these innovations eliminated the dangers of strategic bombing, but they shifted the odds slightly in favor of the Americans, and slight advantages accumulated over hundreds of missions. The ultimate test of LeMay's tactical theories came on August 17, 1943, during the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. LeMay commanded the Regensburg portion of the raid, leading 146 B-17 seconds deep into Germany to strike Messerschmitt fighter production facilities. The mission plan called for his force to bomb Regensburg, then continue south to North Africa instead of returning to England, a shuttle raid designed to confuse German defenders. The mission was a calculated gamble. Regensburg lay beyond the range of Allied fighter escorts. The bombers would fly deep into Germany without protection, relying entirely on their defensive firepower and formation discipline to survive. German fighters attacked in waves throughout the penetration, using every tactic they had developed against American formations. Head-on passes with cannons blazing, coordinated attacks from multiple angles simultaneously, rocket attacks from beyond machine gun range. The Luftwaffe threw everything at LeMay's formation. 24 bombers went down during the mission, a loss rate of 16%. By any measure, it was a bloody day. But the survivors reached Regensburg, maintained straight and level flight through heavy flak, and put their bombs directly on target with devastating accuracy. Post-war analysis determined that the raid set back Messerschmitt fighter production by months, preventing hundreds of aircraft from reaching Luftwaffe squadrons at a critical period of the air war. The tactical success came at terrible cost, but it validated LeMay's central argument. Precision bombing with proper tactics could achieve strategic objectives even against heavily defended targets. The Schweinfurt portion of the same raid, conducted by a different division, suffered even worse losses. 60 B-17 seconds were shot down out of 230 dispatched, a casualty rate approaching 26%. The difference in loss rates between the two forces conducting the same mission on the same day sparked intense analysis within 8th Air Force. LeMay's division had slightly better survival rates, despite flying farther into enemy territory. His units maintained tighter formation discipline. His crews stuck to the straight-line bombing approach even under heavy attack. The correlation suggested that his tactical methods worked even in the worst conditions. The lessons from Schweinfurt-Regensburg influenced strategic decisions for the remainder of the European air war. Deep penetration missions without fighter escort were suspended until long-range fighters became available. When the P-51 Mustang entered service in early 1944 with sufficient range to escort bombers to Berlin and back, the strategic campaign resumed with renewed intensity. But the fundamental tactical principles LeMay established in late 1942 remained standard. Fly straight through the flak, maintain formation discipline, hit the target on the first try. By mid-1944, when LeMay transferred to the Pacific Theater to command B-29 operations against Japan, his tactical legacy was firmly established in Europe. The 8th Air Force had grown to become the largest air combat organization in history, capable of putting more than 1,000 heavy bombers over Germany in a single day. Those bombers flew using tactics that LeMay had pioneered with the 305th Bomb Group back in November 1942. Straight-line bomb runs, disciplined formation flying, precision targeting based on careful intelligence analysis. The impact on the German war effort was cumulative and devastating. By late 1944, Allied strategic bombing had destroyed much of Germany's synthetic fuel production capacity. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe couldn't fly its aircraft even though factories continued producing new fighters. Panzer divisions sat immobile for lack of gasoline. The German economy, which had somehow continued functioning despite years of bombing, finally began to collapse under the sustained precision attacks that LeMay's tactics had made possible. The irony of LeMay's innovation was that it appeared so simple in retrospect. Fly straight to hit the target accurately, maintain formation for mutual defense, follow doctrine instead of instinct. These weren't revolutionary concepts. They were basic military principles applied to strategic bombing. But it took someone with LeMay's combination of mathematical analysis, tactical insight, and sheer courage to implement them under combat conditions. His decision to fly the first mission personally was crucial. If he had simply ordered his crews to fly straight through flak while he remained safely at headquarters, the tactic would have been rejected as the fantasy of a commander disconnected from combat reality. By putting himself in the lead aircraft, by exposing himself to the same risks he asked his men to accept, LeMay earned the moral authority to demand the discipline his tactics required. The men called him Iron Ass, but they followed him into hell because they knew he would be in front, taking the first risks, proving his theories with his own life on the line. The straight-line bombing technique spread beyond the 8th Air Force. The 15th Air Force, operating from Italy against targets in southern Germany and the Balkans, adopted the same tactics. When the strategic bombing campaign expanded to include attacks on oil facilities in Romania, those missions succeeded largely because American bombers could actually hit the refineries and storage tanks instead of scattering bombs across the countryside. The cumulative effect of improved accuracy, multiplied across thousands of missions, represented a fundamental shift in strategic bombing effectiveness. Post-war analysis of the European air campaign consistently highlighted tactical innovation as a key factor in Allied victory. The Germans had excellent aircraft, skilled pilots, and sophisticated defensive systems, but they couldn't compensate for the American ability to adapt tactics based on combat experience, implement changes quickly across large organizations, and maintain operational discipline under the most intense pressure. LeMay's straight-line bombing exemplified this adaptive capacity. The human cost of strategic bombing remained staggering even with improved tactics. The 8th Air Force suffered 26,000 killed in action during the European campaign, more casualties than the entire Marine Corps sustained in the Pacific. Bomber crews faced statistical odds that gave them less than 50% chance of surviving a 25-mission tour. Later in the war, when the odds improved slightly, tour requirements increased to 35 missions. Many crews never completed their tours, shot down by fighters or flak, killed by mechanical failures, lost to weather, or simply worn down by the accumulated stress of combat. But LeMay's innovation meant that the casualties achieved strategic results. Targets were destroyed, German production capacity declined, the oil ran out, The transportation network collapsed when Allied armies invaded France in June 1944. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength, unable to contest Allied air superiority because strategic bombing had destroyed the fuel and facilities needed to sustain flight operations. The bombers had done their job. LeMay himself never claimed moral high ground for strategic bombing. He understood that the tactics he pioneered killed German civilians along with military personnel. Precision bombing was never perfectly precise. Bombs fell on neighborhoods adjacent to factories. Workers' housing near refineries burned. Even with improved accuracy, strategic bombing was inherently indiscriminate by modern standards. LeMay argued that winning the war justified the methods, that shortening the conflict saved more lives than prolonged fighting would cost, that defeating Nazi Germany required maximum application of available military power, including strategic air power. The debate over strategic bombing's ethics and effectiveness continues to this day, but the tactical reality of LeMay's innovation is beyond dispute. Flying straight and level through flak improved bombing accuracy, reduced the need for repeat missions, and ultimately contributed to Allied victory in Europe. The courage required to implement the tactic came not from technological superiority or numerical advantage, but from discipline, training, and leadership by example. When LeMay's B-17 landed at RAF Chelveston on November 23, 1942, after that first straight-line bomb run over Saint-Nazaire, the crews that had flown with him knew something fundamental had changed. The old way of doing business, the instinctive, evasive maneuvers that felt safe but accomplished nothing, was finished. A new tactical doctrine had been validated in combat, and the man who had conceived it had the scars and the success to prove it worked. The transformation of American strategic bombing from an expensive failure into an effective strategic weapon began that day over Saint-Nazaire. One colonel with a calculator, a commitment to mathematical analysis, and the courage to fly straight into the flak when every instinct screamed evasion. LeMay's unapproved innovation became approved within weeks because it worked. The results spoke louder than regulations. The improved accuracy justified the calculated risk. By war's end, LeMay's tactical principles had become so thoroughly integrated into bomber operations that younger crews probably never questioned them. Of course, you flew straight during the bomb run. Of course, the bombardier had control during the final seconds. Of course, you maintained formation discipline regardless of flak. These were fundamental principles of strategic bombing, taught to every crew during training. But they had been learned at terrible cost by the men who flew combat missions in 1942 and early 1943, before anyone understood what worked and what didn't. The 305th Bomb Group, LeMay's original command, flew combat missions from England until the end of the European War. The group compiled an impressive combat record: 337 missions, more than 9,000 bomber sorties, over 22,000 tons of bombs dropped on German targets. They lost 88 aircraft in combat, a casualty rate roughly in line with other groups in 8th Air Force. But their contribution to Allied victory extended far beyond their own mission count. The tactics they pioneered under LeMay's command became standard throughout the strategic bombing forces, multiplying their impact across thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of missions. LeMay himself went on to greater prominence after the European campaign. He commanded the strategic bombing offensive against Japan, developing the low-level incendiary tactics that destroyed Japanese cities in early 1945. After the war, he built Strategic Air Command into the Cold War deterrent, a force that kept nuclear peace for decades. He served as Air Force Chief of Staff. He became one of the most controversial military figures in American history, praised by some as the architect of air power, criticized by others for his willingness to embrace total war. But his most important contribution to military aviation happened in the skies over Saint-Nazaire on November 23, 1942, when he proved that courage, discipline, and mathematical analysis could overcome instinct and conventional wisdom. The pilot's unapproved trick wasn't really a trick at all. It was the application of basic principles under combat conditions, validated by someone willing to stake his life on his calculations, and it changed the war. The legacy lives on in modern precision strike doctrine, GPS-guided munitions, laser-designated bombs, cruise missiles programmed to hit specific buildings in specific cities, all descend from LeMay's insight that accuracy matters more than volume, that destroying the right target is more important than bombing safely, that winning wars requires accepting calculated risks to achieve strategic objectives. The technology has evolved beyond recognition. The fundamental principle remains unchanged. Fly straight, hit the target, win the war. Curtis LeMay figured that out in 1942 with a calculator, a controversial theory, and the courage to fly the first mission himself. His men called him Iron Ass. History called him right. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.